Welcome to the Wheelbarrow Series PowerPoint on growing great greens. In this session, we're going to concentrate on growing great greens in the fall. In Kentucky, we can grow them in the spring and the fall, but for this particular PowerPoint video, we're going to concentrate on just the fall plantings. Here, we're going to start with gardening basics. There are some things that you do need to grow good greens or great greens. First off, you need to select a sunny spot that gets about 8 hours full sun daily. These plants do need full sun. Even though a lot of these are cool weather plants, they still like to have a lot of sun. A relatively level spot is going to be ideal, but I know some of you don't have that. But if you don't have that, just try to pick the most level spot that you do have for your vegetable gardening. You do need well-drained soil, just like all our other vegetables. They do not like to be wet. Also, it's a good thing to have some water source nearby if we have a dry spell, especially trying to start these when the weather's hot like it is now in the summer. It takes a little more water to get these started than it would normally in the spring. But the great thing is you're going to get a better product at the end compared to what you would get if you're planting spring greens and they're maturing when the weather's actually warmer. Also, avoid planting near trees because tree roots, believe it or not, can go pretty far away from the trunks of trees, and they will zap a lot of the nutrients and a lot of the water out of that soil in that area. So a little planting. Smaller is usually better. You can produce a lot of greens in a small area, and you just need to realize that you may not eat as many as you can grow. So start small. There's no reason to plant an acre or have a large area of these because a little bit of greens goes a long way. Do a soil test and then fertilize accordingly. Most of us, if you did a soil test back in the spring, that soil test is still good. You can just add nutrients based on what that soil test said. Even if you grew a summer garden there, just go ahead and reapply some of that fertilizer because the summer plants probably used most of that fertilizer up, and it's not going to hurt to add a little more for your fall garden. Organic matter is also a great way to improve the structure of your soil. It's also a good way to grow or to add organic matter and to nutrients to your soil. So make sure you go ahead and have some of that if you have it on hand. Be sure though, if you do use manures, that they are aged. They need to be at least 120 days old. So you don't want to use fresh manure and then plant greens right behind that because you have a high risk of getting E. coli from that those greens then from the manure. So just keep that in mind. So more planting, succession planting is great. It's good to keep a fresh amount of greens on hand that way. We do have a publication called ID 128 that is great if anybody wants that, and it just kind of gives you an idea of when to plant and kind of to have a continuous succession of plants. It also has some charts on it that tells you how much to grow based on how many people's in your family and those sorts of things. Also, you want to select disease-resistant cultivars. With greens, that's not as big an issue as it is with some other crops like tomatoes, but just keep in mind that you do want to pick the best cultivars for our region. And you can also consult family members for their input on based on what kinds of greens they like. There's no reason to plant kale if a lot of people in the family don't like kale, but just plant accordingly. Also, some of these greens are used for cover crops, and what we don't eat, we can turn under later in the winter or even the spring. So it's not a huge deal, but just it's good to plant what everyone likes. So why grow your own? First off, safety. There's been a lot of things in the news lately of people getting sick from growing or for buying greens at the store. Usually it's the bagged greens that have been washed and processed and ready for you to eat. Something gets in the wash water and then you've got, 30,000 bags of greens that could be or possibly infected with E. coli or something like that. Also, you get a lot better product growing your own because you go straight out to the garden, you pick it and you eat it right then, so you get a great tasting product and it's fresher. One thing about fall greens, they are so much better than spring greens because the weather's getting cooler as they're maturing, so they have much better flavor, much sweeter flavor, just a whole lot better product than what you would get in the spring. Also, nutrition. Darker leaves are more nutritious, but greens in general are vitamin powerhouses. I know in the last few years, kale has been considered a superfood. There really isn't any superfoods. I've got a little link there if you want to go look at that. All foods that are good for us are superfoods, but some of these are higher packed with nutrients, and greens are generally packed with a lot of nutrients that are really good for us. Most of your greens can be started early or late without special techniques. Just to give you an idea, planting seasons for spring greens is around March the 1st in the spring, depending on what you're growing. You can go all the way up into to April with those, planting that is. And then basically our fall planting green starts around August the 15th and goes to September the 15th, depending on what crops you're growing. Longer maturing crops, you're going to plant that August the 15th. Shorter maturing crops, you can plant that later date at September the 15th. Greens are basically any crop we grow to eat. It can be the leaves or the stems. And we have interchangeable, we use greens as being salad greens or cooked greens. But as you know, most people will eat greens like lettuce fresh and then will actually cook the kale or the collards or something like that. Some common salad greens. This is just a little chart here of a lot of different greens that you can actually grow. Granted, radicchio and some of those are pretty bitter, even if grown in great conditions. And some people really like that bitter. Some people don't. It's up to you which ones you like. This is, if you hit that link there, it'll just take you to a guide, and it's a little chart of all the different greens, and they've got them numbered there, and it shows you what each one's actually called. And just the pun there, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Ha ha, LOL. Some different types of lettuces. We have romaine or loose leaf there at the top in that picture. That is a little longer maturing lettuce for us. Usually, it's good to buy those in little transplants if you're going to plant this time of year. We also have butterheads or soft heads or bibs. That's the middle picture. That's the ones that we grow quite often here in Kentucky. Um, those are really good, really fresh tasting. They really don't like the hot weather right now, so you may want to wait just a little bit to plant those. And then we have the crisp heads or the head lettuce. That's the iceberg types of lettuces. They're the hardest to grow, and really in our climate, they're really not, in my opinion, worth fooling with. Hot weather they hate, but they're going to be maturing when it's cooler, but they've got to get through this hot spell. A lot of times, vice versa, in the spring, the head will actually collapse on it and rot. So just stick with the romaines, the loose leaf lettuces, the butterheads, soft heads, those kinds of things, bib lettuces. You'll be a lot happier with those. Some other greens you can grow. We have chicory, endive, arugula, corn salad, etc. Lots of those out there. Some of these are the more bitter types of greens, and some people really like those flavors. Some people don't. I kind of like them mixed in with some of the other greens just to kind of offset the flavors, but a whole salad for me of arugula is a little bit too bitter. Johnny's and Baker Creek Seed Savers Exchange are some companies that actually sell a lot of these different kinds of greens. There's a lot more seed companies out there. I'm not recommending any in particular. That's just a couple right off the top of my head there that are pretty common, and you can get a lot of different types of greens. Um, Again, some of these are very bitter. They can get a little bit hot in dry weather, so you want to eat them young or plant them late whenever you know we're going to have cool weather. There's just a little chart there on that link that you can go to Johnny Seeds, and they have salad mixes and those kinds of things if you like those. Also, starting early, like as hot as it is going to be probably next week, if you're going to try to start some of these from seed, a little shade is not going to hurt. If you've got a way to shade that a little bit, like this raised bed here, they've got a little shade cloth over it. That's going to help keep those a little bit cooler. Still give plenty of sun, but just keep that temperature down just a little bit while these are getting started and they're young. Because again, these are cool season plants. So we have some greens. These are what we consider generally cooked before eating. Those are turnip greens, collard greens, kale. There's kale flower sprouts. We're flower sprouts now. We have mustards. You can still eat these raw if you like the flavor of them raw. I mean, a raw kale salad to me is pretty good. Some people don't like that kind of chewiness, but you know, they're each their own. But generally, we cook these a little bit. And then you can eat cooked or raw. There's cabbage, spinach, Chinese cabbage, dandelion greens. There are really great, believe it or not, dandelion green varieties out there that you can buy that have really large leaves. Um, don't worry, they're not the type that go out in the yard like the type we have here, that which you can actually also eat, by the way. Then we have kohlrabi. If you've not tried kohlrabi, it's a really good kind of you eat the fat stem of it. You can also eat the leaves of it, but the stem has kind of got a cabbage turnip flavor and a little texture, more like a turnip. Makes really good slaw. It's really good cooked as well. And then we have Swiss chard. Swiss chard is one of those really neat plants that you could have actually planted in the spring. let it grow all summer. Now in the middle of summer, the flavor's not great, but you just keep harvesting. You just kind of toss it. If you've got chickens or livestock or something, you can feed it to them during that time of year. They'll eat it right up. And then come fall, whenever it gets cooler again, it's still growing. You have nice big leaves that you can eat then. You can also just plant a fall crop if you'd like to do that, which you can still do. So there's lots of different ways to plant these greens and get crops that can go more than one season. Another one of those is kale. If you plant kale like Winterbor or one of those in the spring, you can let that grow all summer. Just keep harvesting the bottom leaves off of it and toss that when they start getting bitter. But just keep that harvested. It'll keep the plant growing up. And then whenever the weather cools back down, then you can start harvesting it, eating it for yourself. And last year, these went pretty far into winter before they got killed back. So these can, if we have a very mild winter, they can actually go all the way into the next season. So culture, greens are cool season vegetables that do need full sun, so it kind of makes them difficult for us, especially in the fall. They're going to be so much better flavor in the fall, but we've got to get them started while it's hot, and that's not ideal for them. We generally get two good cropping seasons. Like I said, we get a spring and a fall. Most can be sown directly into the garden, again, in mid-March and mid-August to mid-September. Talked about that earlier. And then raised beds are also a good option for greens because you've got the raised bed, you've got the nice loose soil that you've amended and added to that, and it's easy for you to plant them by hand that way. And you can also have usually a lot less weed problem in a raised bed situation because you're kind of on top of that and keeping that weeded during the season if some weeds get in there. So we're up to planting. An application of complete fertilizer, such as 4 pounds of triple 10 per 100 square feet, or can be incorporated into the top 3 to 4 inches of soil before planting. That is if you didn't do a soil test. If you did a soil test, follow that soil test recommendation, obviously. Leaf and small head lettuces and turnips, you can sow them about a 1/4 inch deep and thin to 4 to 6 inches apart. I know many of us around here will take turnips and broadcast those over the garden and use them as a cover crop and eat what we want and let the rest of them stay out there. That's also fine to do. These do grow better if you do thin them out, though. You'll get a lot quicker turnaround from sowing to being able to eat them. Mustards and spinach, you want to plant about a 1/2 inch deep and thin to 4 to 6 inches. Also, they're nice to use as a cover crop for this for this season. You can eat again what you want, get rid of the rest. But winter takes its toll on it, and then just turn it under. Swiss chard and kale, about a 1/2 inch deep. This is the ones that, and you can do kale as a cover crop as well, but you're gonna get a better product if you buy the little seedlings that they've got out right now, and you go ahead and plant those and give them 8 to 12 inches. You're gonna get a nice big plant, and you get a lot more harvest off of just a few plants that way. So if you've got a smaller area, you're not just going to broadcast over the garden for a cover crop. It's much better to plant these individual plants and take care of those, and they will produce quite a lot of product for you. Thinning should not be delayed, again, because you'll get weak, spindly plants with little foliage. And again, we're trying to get foliage for these plants because that's what we're wanting to harvest. So give them some room, let them grow. You can also plant successive crops at 7 to 10 day intervals for continuous harvest for some of these. Overall, though, most of these, the ones we just talked about here, you can harvest and let them regrow and keep harvesting them down, through until the weather takes them out. So for me, it's not so much for the mustards, the kales, the Swiss chards, all those that you actually need to plant successive crops. Now with lettuces, you're probably going to want to because you don't want it all at one time because you can't eat it all. So you just plant little areas of it, every 7 to 10 days, and that way you'll have it spread out where you'll have some lettuce all the way into very cold weather. You want to mulch to conserve your moisture. This is very, very important for our fall garden because it dries out. Usually falls are dry here, and you're going to probably have to water some of these things. So mulch is going to help you. It's going to keep your soil cool. It's going to reduce your weed pressure. So there's 3 big things there that mulch is definitely a great thing for you to do. Another thing is these do not grow well in black plastic because it's too hot unless you're going to cover that plastic with something like a mulch to keep it cool. So it just, for my opinion, keep the plastic out for these crops because they're cool season and they do much better if they're kept cool. So just a regular mulch. It could be straw. I would avoid hay because of the seeds, but if you've got clean hay, that would work as well. You can use leaf mold, grass clippings, even if it's grass that's not have a lot of weeds in it. Again, you want to keep the weeds out because you don't want to have problems next year with those. A second application of fertilizer bandage should be applied when plants are 2 to 3 inches tall. Lightly work that in next to the plants if you can, or work it in followed by irrigation. Again, the irrigation is going to get that nutrient to the plant. Also, kale can benefit from a third application when they're about 8 inches tall. Those plants are longer lived, a little hardier than some of the other greens, so they may need a little more fertilizer to get them really going, where you get those nice big leaves off of it. Also, a little note there, many of the greens have a better flavor if grown in the fall. Again, talked about that earlier, and harvested after the weather cools. So we're going to harvest these likely even past frost, because many of these are at least frost hardy, maybe not freeze hardy. So we may go into November with these depending on the type of weather we have in the fall. So some loose leaf lettuces, you usually can harvest those between 41 and 50 days. So if you planted those now, you're looking at by the end of September getting those, well, yeah, about the end of September, getting those ready to eat. And then we have romaine lettuce, generally takes 80 to 80 days. That's why I recommend just buying those in little transplants already up. You can knock off 2 or 3 weeks off of that production time that way. And then we have the butter and crisp heading varieties. They're up to 80 to 90 days. Those are the ones you're probably going to want to go ahead and get some seedlings on those as well, because they're going to take a little more time, and you want to knock that time back just a little bit. Most greens are not harvested fully, meaning individual leaves are taken. Again, you have to spread your harvest out that way. Take the larger leaves, leave the smaller leaves to keep growing, and you can go all the way into a hard frost that way. Also, all greens and lettuces should be harvested when fully hydrated. You don't want to harvest these in the afternoon, early in the morning, or late in the evening. It's going to be best whenever these are as fresh as they can be. Personally, I prefer early in the morning because they've had all night to rehydrate, and they're really nice and crisp in the morning that way. You can keep a lot of these in the fridge as well. I like to take just one of the plastic grocery bags that you have left over from bringing home the groceries, and harvest these and just put them in there loosely and just wrap them over into that bag and just set them in the fridge. Put them in the crisper. They'll keep several days that way, if not even a week, depending on the varieties that you're harvesting. Romaines will keep quite a long time that way. Few problems you might come up with. We have some fungal pathogens that will attack lettuce, especially generally in cool, damp weather. So this is probably going to be an issue that's going to happen later into the fall. If you get a plant that looks like this and you see those look like little mustard seeds on there, that's called southern blight. Just take those plants out and get rid of them. That southern blight can overwinter as that little mustard seed looking thing, which is it's kind of like it's the way it overwinters. So it's good to, after the weather gets cold and everything dies, to plow your garden and turn those under, because they will degrade in the soil. They kind of can maintain themselves if left up to surface. Plant resistant cultivars, again, if you have some particular problems, we can go through some cultivars that you may want to look into. But for the most part, for our situations in our area, we do not have a lot of fungal problems in our greens and in our kales and those kinds of things, any of them. Not you might get a problem every once in a while, but it's usually nothing that's going to take the whole crop out. A bigger issue for us with our greens is going to be insects in our area. That first picture there, the light green one at the top, that one is aphids. You can get these on any of these crops. Usually on our greens, they're going to be the green type of aphids, but they come in multiple colors, so don't be surprised if you even get red or yellow or even black aphids on your cole crops. Just keep a lookout for them. Aphids are not going to be your number one problem. There's going to be 2 problems here, going to be your worst 2 problems. The second one there, you see that little black beetle, that is a flea beetle. That's going to be a huge problem for most of your greens, things like kale and collards. I know broccoli and cabbage and cauliflower are not considered greens necessarily, cabbages I guess, but they'll be all over those as well, so keep in mind with those that you're going to have to probably spray for those. The next one down is the cabbage looper or cabbage worm. There's a few types of worms that will eat on these cole crops, as we would call some of these. They're not as bad on lettuce, but they're going to really hit your kales and collards and those kinds of things pretty hard. So probably going to have to spray for those. You can go organic if you want to try for something like a pyrethrin or for the looper there, for the little caterpillars, you can do Dipel, which is organic. It's a BT, but that's not going to help you with the flea beetle. The flea beetle and the cabbage worms both, you could try some insecticidal soaps. You probably won't be that effective with those. The easiest way is to spray those is going to hit them with something like 7. It's going to take both of those out. You may have to do it every 2 or 3 weeks. Just keep note of when you start to see a few little holes or whatever that you may need to spray. And you can see that cabbage there. You can see what that cabbage worm has done to that cabbage. And that's probably, those leaves wrap around themselves. There's probably damage all the way inside of that head because they just didn't keep them under control. Another thing you might find, especially as the weather cools and dampens, is some slugs. That's a slug there at the on far right at the bottom there. Those will especially like the lettuces more than the bigger leaf things like the kales and the collards and the bitter greens and those kinds of things. Just if you start to see some damage on that, that's really easy to take care of as well. You could do the slug bait, which you just broadcast it around the base of the plants and the slugs will eat it. If you want to go more organic, you can always do the beer can, or the coffee can buried in the ground with the lip of it right at the surface of the soil, and just fill it with maybe a can of beer, and they'll come to that malt and fall in. You can use, you don't have to have regular beer. You can even have the non-alcoholic beer. They're not coming for the alcohol. They're coming for the malt. So either one, you can take care of those that way too. So we go to microgreens, which is probably a different type of green than most of us are probably growing around here, but they are very good. They're eaten very young. They're tender. A lot of different kinds of crops that we can harvest as seedlings and eat. They're grown to their first true leaf stage, which means they're germinating. They start to grow their first true leaves, and then we cut them, and then we eat those as microgreens. They are different from sprouts because they're actually getting to grow. They're not just sprouting, so they're actually starting to get some new leaves. They are labor intensive, especially if you want to grow a lot of these, but they are easy. They're best started indoors. You can do those in a greenhouse or a high tunnel or a cold frame. They grow really well under if you've got a grow light, and you're only keeping them under there for 7 to 14 days, and then you're harvest them. That's something really nice if you wanted to do that in the wintertime to have some fresh microgreens. You do want to use the sterile medium. It does require very little, if any, fertilizer, because again, these are not growing long enough for them to actually need any fertilizer. They're just using what was in their stored in their seed itself. They're again ready to harvest in about 7 to 14 days. They are highly perishable, and they're generally eaten raw or used as a garnish. You'll see them on a lot of TV shows that way. And a little time for insect or disease problems to occur as well. So it's kind of a quick turnaround, so you don't have to worry about a lot of pest problems. You don't have to worry about soil problems, those kinds of things. Here's a partial list of possible microgreens. I'm not going to run through all those. You all can read. But amaranth is probably one that you're probably not familiar with. Just to give you an idea, that is one of the ancient grains, but it's also some plants around here that are actually in that family. Would be the pigweed and some of those weeds, but not sure those weeds are edible, but they're in that same family. And you can go all the way through that. We got buckwheat, broccoli, dill even, fennel. All these are just harvested right after they grow their first set of true leaves, or starting to grow their first set of true leaves, and you just cut them off, rinse them off, and then you eat them like that. Sprouts, they're just simply germinated seedlings. They're not actually growing in soil at all. They can be eaten raw or cooked. Most common we have are alfalfa sprouts, also mung bean. You'll see those at some of the Chinese restaurants and things. Soybeans, lentils, cabbage, radish, and rye. There's lots of different ones that we can eat that way. You only use seeds labeled for sprouting. Don't go out and get some out of the bag that was meant to be planted in a field, because you don't know where that seed's been, what's been on that seed, and it wasn't produced for actual consumption at that point. So again, order the seeds that are meant to be used for sprouts. Where to buy? Well, you can do them online. Health food stores have a lot of these. Produce section of stores, a lot of different places will have these. Usually around here, they're going to be hard to find those. Locally, you're probably going to have to go to Louisville or Lexington, Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or somewhere like that, one of the more health food stores. So just keep in mind not to use ones that are meant to be planted in the ground, because you don't know what's been applied to those. Again, why grow your own? Well, They're tasty. They're safer if you grow your own because there has been some of these sold that people have gotten sick from salmonella and some other bacterial problems. But also sprouts are quite expensive, so they're a lot cheaper if you grow your own. So you can grow your own here. Here's a hint. You don't need an actual sprouter. A mason jar is fine. There's a little link there. It tells you how to do it. Basically, you're just soaking the seeds a little bit or putting just a tiny bit of water in there and getting them warm and just letting everything germinate, and then you're going to rinse them and you can eat them. Little nutrition on sprouts. They are pretty nutritious. You can see by this chart. There's protein there as a seed and then as a sprout. And actually, some of these have more protein after sprouted than they did before they were sprouted, which is kind of interesting. The fat actually goes down after they're germinated, and then the fiber goes up in alfalfa and down in hemp. It's just interesting to see some of those. And then you jump over to some of the actual nutrition, and a lot of this goes up after it's germinated. So like the vitamin C increases from 7 to 39 in alfalfa sprouts and from 0 to 38 in mung bean sprouts. But it's kind of interesting just to see how you would think germinating these would decrease the nutrients, but actually it's the opposite. We have some season extensions that we can do to increase our production of greens further into the season. This is a cold frame here, and we'll go through how to use one of those. So we also have a hotbed. The difference between a hotbed and a cold frame is a cold frame is just setting up on top of the soil surface with a window that you can raise up and down on it to keep it warm. It's kind of like a mini unheated greenhouse or high tunnel. And then the hotbed is actually dug down, and they put fresh manure in the bottom, soil over top, and then they put the sash of the window on top of that, and they add soil up around it. So that manure, as it decomposes underneath a good thick layer of soil, actually releases heat, and it will actually raise that temperature. So they're adding about 12 to 18 inches of manure under the hotbed, and then 4 to 6 inches of soil on top of that. And then you want to plant when the soil temp drops to 85 degrees because it can get quite warm. Here's just an example of one of those cold frames. This is a cold frame, not a hotbed. And you can see that they've actually got a contraption there that opens that window some if it gets too hot. But also notice that we have pansies are pretty tough plants anyway, but the pansies are actually blooming in there, and they've got, what, a foot of soil around that. The soil around that actually is a little bit of insulation because, or soil, I'm sorry, snow around that is actually a little bit of insulation. Snow, underneath the snow, it's 32 degrees, just at freezing. It's not below freezing. So the air temperature can be below freezing. It could be 0, but the insulation around that from the snow is keeping that outside of that box at 32. Well, now the window is going to be more exposed, but if it snows on top of that, then in that box, it can't get any colder than 32 if it's completely covered with snow. Also, they've got, if you see that bucket back there in the frame there, that's likely filled with water. That water will absorb heat during the day from the sun, and then it'll radiate that heat out at night and keep that temperature up a little bit in the cold frame. So as far as conserving energy in these, if you wanted to add an extra heat source without actually having to have electricity or something like that ran to your box, you can notice that this one is got the soil around it. That's for insulation, and also the windows are slanted so it can get more sunlight during the winter time. So you're getting a little more heat, and that will heat that soil up inside that box and around that box, and it will hold that temperature in there in the wintertime just a little above whatever the outside temperature is. So other ways to conserve energy, we talked about the manure, we talked about the slanting your windows and then adding soil around your box. I mentioned this earlier also, though, is the tub of water inside of there. It needs to be a pretty good sized tub of water in there. That will hold a lot of radiant heat and give that back out at night. If it gets up to 85 or 90 in that box and say it's 35 outside, that water temperature is going to warm up to that, and then that's going to give off some heat during the night whenever it gets colder. Other ways to extend the season, you can do hoop house or high tunnels. They're relatively inexpensive compared to greenhouses. I say relatively inexpensive. Most of us are not going to have one of those unless we're doing some commercial production. Um, but you can do a small version of that in the backyard without actually having to buy a kit. But greenhouses, just to give you an idea, are about $20 a square foot. High tunnels are about 50 cents a square foot. So it's basically just a frame with some plastic. Usually, high tunnels are single layer plastic. There's no heat or cooling other than venting, so you can raise the sides or open the doors. Again, this is not heated. Some of us might want to heat one and make it a greenhouse in the spring and a high tunnel later on in the summer or the fall. It's totally up to you what you'd want to do with any of that. But irrigation is a must because it's not raining in there. So you're going to have to water. The water source for these plants are going to come from you. Um, these high tunnels, if they're grown in for year after year after year, you do tend to end up having to move it eventually because you get a buildup of insect and disease pressure in there to a point that that soil needs rest and that area is needs to have some rest and some actual cold weather to help take care of some of the problems that might pop up. Most cool months, though, in Kentucky, the high tunnels can be used for lettuce and green production. I know a lot of people last year, they grew greens and things the entire winter in their high tunnels. The only problem is you get little to no growth from mid-December through January. So you still have to take care of the plants, but then they'll take off as the days get longer. Mid-December through January, we basically have very little sunlight, and when we do, it's usually cloudy. So those are the biggest issue for growing those in the very middle of winter. So also what we're used to, season extension, is using a remade fabric. We used to call them tobacco canvas. Remade fabric is usually our floating row covers, what you hear nowadays. But you can probably get another 2 or 3 weeks into the fall, another 2 or 3 weeks earlier in the spring just by using a row cover, especially on these cool season plants. So that's something pretty easy and pretty inexpensive for us to do. You just have to pull it over the plants and weight it down or even put it over a hoop. Usually, though, we can lay this right over the plants and let plants just push it up as they grow. And you just have to have something to hold down the edges. Usually, we just use some wires that we stuck in the ground to hold them down. Some more alternative production methods. You have some raised beds. You can see that little raised bed there. They put plastic over it. That plastic, if you look closely, though, does have vent holes. It's just not solid plastic over that. If you were to just put plastic over that bed and cover it with rocks on a sunny day, everything in there would burn up. So you do have to have some vents for that. And the next one over there, they've got the floating row cover over their box there, and they've got it just little hoops over it. So even though you've got a raised bed, you can still get some season extension by using some of these other techniques. We do have some other alternative production methods for greens, which most of us, any of us, or hardly any of us, are going to do at home. But I just want to show you some pictures of some urban um, agriculture here, where they're actually growing some of these greens and things in warehouses and selling to restaurants. There's hydroponic there, where they're just floating on the water, and the water's circulating under the plants with nutrients in it, and the plants grow. They're actually under a grow light as well. I don't know what they're getting out of these greens, but it must be a pretty good amount of money because they're selling directly to restaurants because they're having to pay for that electricity for those grow lights. A lot of the new grow lights, though, are LED, and they don't take very much electricity like some of the older uh, lights did, and they don't put out the heat. These are some pictures from a trip I took to Wisconsin a few years back. This is more of the urban agriculture, and you can see in this picture they're just growing sprouts in that greenhouse right there. Actually, this was a aquaponics setup as well. So they had the tilapia in some tanks with the floating uh, greens on top, and then they got into doing these microgreens, basically flat after flat after flat in this greenhouse. You don't even need a lot of light for those because they're just going to germinate, grow to the first set of true leaves, and then they're just going to cut them off and sell them. This actually is where I first tasted a sunflower sprout, which was absolutely delicious. That's something really easy that you can do right at home, and it's very inexpensive. There's pictures of some more of these urban greenhouses. These were all in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I mean downtown urban area, and they were growing and were very successful selling to the restaurants in the local area. Just a few more pictures there. The first picture there is just a setup that they were it was just a demo of a little aquaponic setup they had where they had a little pump circulating the water under, and then they had the plants floating, and that was Swiss chard under the grow light. And then that next picture there is looks like the pea sprouts. So if you like sweet peas, the sprouts taste like the actual little spring peas, so they're pretty tasty too. This was a larger warehouse where they were growing only greens. They started out with aquaponics with fish, and they found out that the greens were a lot more productive. So you can see racks on top of racks of greens there with lights over them, and the water circulated through all those boxes where they were floating, and it was just a 24/7 production that way. You can see they even put a little extra plastic up, so whenever the cold weather comes in, they're not having to heat the entire building to the temperature that those greens would really like. So that wraps up our Growing Great Greens. If anybody has any questions, you can contact me at the Washington County Extension Office at 859-336-7741. Happy gardening.